Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, social marketers around the world. My name is Christine Jennings, and I'm pleased to introduce the 42nd in a series of webinars designed to advance social marketing teaching, research, and practice. I'm here today with Tamara Harber and Dave Cutter, as well as our guest speakers, Professors Jeff French and Doug Evans. Tamara and I will manage any questions you have for Jeff and Doug, and Dave will be our technical host working the magic behind the scenes for this webinar. We'll begin in just a moment, but before we do, I'd like to share some information about the International Social Marketing Association, since we're welcoming both ISMA members and people who may not be familiar with our professional association. ISMA is a federation of individuals and 6 regional member associations. When you join ISMA, you automatically become a member of your regional association as well. So you get the benefit of international-based resources and information relevant to your region. Together, we advance behavior change for social good. Our members are change agents from all sectors, from behavioral scientists and researchers, psychologists, environmental educators, health communicators, academics, practitioners, and students. Anyone eager to learn new tools to change behavior will benefit from becoming a member. Your membership in ISMA includes access to resources such as online training, professional journals, conference discounts, and our webinar archive of over 40 recorded webinars. Today's webinar is being recorded and will soon be available in our members-only archive. We have quarterly webinars like this that feature speakers and issues from around the world. We also encourage you to follow us on LinkedIn, Twitter, or Facebook to stay updated. Today's webinar is timely as we work to implement the largest public health response to a global pandemic in the history of humankind. The ISMA website is a great resource. It has a wealth of COVID-19 social marketing resources from across the globe. So if you haven't checked that out yet, I encourage you to go to the site. Volunteers and members of ISMA are doing their best to keep the resources as updated as possible as things are rapidly changing through the pandemic. Finally, one more welcome before I turn it over to today's speakers and our moderator. Our registration numbers suggest close to half of you may be new to social marketing. We're so glad you joined us. We hope you come away inspired by the potential for using social marketing strategies for good. Social marketing seeks to develop and integrate marketing concepts with other approaches like education or policies to influence behaviors that benefit individuals and communities for the greater social good. You can learn more about the practice on the ISMA website, and I'm sure that many of the resources and things that Jeff and Doug will be discussing today will also help you in your journey into learning more about social marketing. Next, I'd like to turn the webinar over to get us started to Tamara Harber, our moderator for today's session. Tamara?
Thank you, Christine. I'm happy to introduce our 2 speakers today. We have Doug Evans with us, who is currently Professor of Health Communication and Social Marketing at the Milken Institute of Public Health, George Washington University. He works in the United States and in low and middle income countries worldwide with projects going on funded by the National Institutes of Health and other major foundations. Doug brings us his expertise gained from his research into social marketing, social and behavior change communication, digital health, branding, and applied experimental research methods. Our other speaker is Jeff French, who is the CEO of Strategic Social Marketing and also Professor of Social Marketing at Brighton University Business School. Jeff is a past board member of the International Social Marketing Association and a current board member of the European Social Marketing Association. Jeff is a global thought leader in social marketing, having worked in over 30 countries and published over 100 papers and 5 books. He's also the main author of the Technical Social Marketing Guide, developed in 2014 for the European Center for Disease Prevention and Control. So we are clearly in good hands for today's webinar. Thanks to both Doug and Jeff for being here today to offer us their insights on such an important subject at such an important time. We're really looking forward to hearing from you. So over to you, starting with Doug.
Hi, everyone. Really pleased to be here today. Let me just start us off with a little bit of background and give you the basic thesis for our presentation today. So the evidence tells us that there are 10 key actions that will enhance the uptake of COVID-19 vaccines. And basically, our thesis is that the more of these actions that are applied, the more effective, efficient, and ethical our interventions will be. Next slide. So a bit more background. I think we're all very familiar with this from current events, but it's clear now that significant sections of populations in many, if not most countries around the world display low trust in governments, lower than in the past, and in vaccine safety in particular. Vaccine hesitancy has also steadily increased in more than 90% of countries since 2014. So this is a significant issue that we face when we think about promoting COVID-19 vaccine uptake. Next slide. Well, so the basic refrain that politicians don't care about people like me, we've asked this question in public opinion studies over the years, and this is some data from Ipsos in 2017, and I think these trends, if anything, have just accelerated, but we see in many developed countries very high levels of feelings that politicians really are not concerned with my welfare and the welfare of people like me. Sweden, 45%, UK, 67%, USA, 71%, France, 78%, just for example, and a global average of 63, a staggering, I would say, 63%. Next slide. And so we can see that these kinds of attitudes are reflected in vaccine hesitancy. And this is some data from just this past year, 2020, from the World Bank. And we see overall, if a new coronavirus COVID-19 vaccine became publicly available, I would take it on an agreement scale, agree or disagree. The total was 74% that either strongly agreed or agreed with this statement. So that means that 26% of people don't agree or are unsure. And we see that there's significant variation in this number across many countries, but strikingly in several developed countries, including the US, the number is down in the 60s. 65% of individuals in the United States said they strongly agreed or agreed with the statement. Other countries like Italy and Germany also in the 60s, France at 60%. So we see that there is significant vaccine hesitancy, and this is really the backdrop to the challenge of promoting COVID-19 uptake. Jeff, over to you.
Okay, thanks, Doug. Next slide. Okay, so there's falling trust around the world in governments and to some extent public health institutions. I was actually reading some data today from Germany. This is not just about the general public having hesitancy and not trusting. There was data I read today was 20% of German nurses are hesitant about getting a vaccine, and about 15% of doctors in Germany also share that hesitancy. So this is a real, big problem that we have, and this falling trust actually requires governments and public health institutions to change the way that they work, to connect more with citizens, create more partnerships with them. Next slide. Okay, one of the other great things about where we are now, and there are a few, is that there's no shortage of guidance. There's great guidance from WHO, CDC, ECDC, many countries' public health institutes. Great teams of fantastic people working on these issues. In some respects, that weight of evidence and data can be an impediment, because we need to kind of cut through that and turn it into something that we can actually action. So that's what Doug, myself, Samir Deshpande, and Raphael Obregon did a few months ago. We took a look at a lot of this data. Next slide, please. And we wrote this paper. The reference for it is here. Please download it and take a look. And in this paper, we came to the conclusion that, as Doug said, there are about 10 key actions that are signifiers or characteristics of effective programs. Next slide. So this is a chart that's taken from that report, and it sets out these kind of 10 key features or characteristics. And what we're going to do today is, fairly rapidly take you through those one by one. But I know what you're thinking now. You're looking at this list and thinking, next slide, please. Wow, that's too much stuff to be doing. Do I have to do all of that stuff to have an effective program? Next slide, please. Well, the unfortunate answer is yes, you do. I know it's a big ask to do all of those things, but the evidence seems to suggest that the more of them that you do, the more the probability is that your program will be effective, efficient, and also ethical. So there are no magic solutions to this. There's not one or two things we can pull off the shelf and say, do this and it will be all fine. It's about being systematic and applying all of those things as much as we can and as thoroughly as we can. Next slide, please. Some of you would have seen this report already, published a couple of weeks ago. I mean, it's fantastic that WHO have convened a behavioral kind of influence group that draws on a wide range of expertise from lots of disciplines, including explicitly social marketing. And the guidance in this document basically confirms where myself, Doug, Samir, and Raphael got to. It neatly, I think, kind of sets out these three kind of key principles, if you like, about creating and enabling environments, creating those, harnessing social influences, and increasing motivation. All of the 10 characteristics we've got quite neatly fit under one or more of those kind of headings. So what we're going to do now is rattle through those 10, giving you a little bit more information about each one and a few examples. So over to you, Doug.
Great, thanks, Jeff. Next slide. So let's start going through the 10 key actions that Jeff and I have been talking about. The first one is systematic and systemic behavioral influence planning. Next slide, please. So I think, those of us who practice social marketing are familiar with this, but those of us who are learning about the field or new to the field and interested may find this useful. I think really one of our key principles in social marketing is that we get results. We're most likely to get successful results of our campaigns, of our promotional efforts, when we have clearly defined aims, goals, and objectives that are specific, that are in SMART format, if you will. Next slide, please. And so this is a model from the ECDC, which I think is comparable to models that are available from other sources, like in the United States and other parts of the world. But it lays out essentially a planning process, a systematic and systemic planning process that involves scoping the effort, testing it, implementing or enacting it, and then learning and acting on the learnings from that process. And really what this starts with is setting clear goals and SMART, in other words, specific, measurable, action-oriented, and so forth, objectives that are clear and that address the influencing factors, understanding our target audiences, developing exchange propositions following marketing principles so that there is a true exchange of value between we as marketers and the audience, and developing effective tactics, and then testing those out, not assuming that we know what's best, but actually pre-testing and piloting them, and then implementing, following best practices, and evaluating those results. So it's a fairly widely held approach, but it's important to remember that this is where we start. And this is true just as much with COVID-19 vaccine promotion as with other aspects of social marketing. Next slide, please. The second key action is audience targeting and segmentation. Next slide. So this is really critical. I think we saw in the earlier data that I spoke about and in Jeff's slides that there really are clearly distinct segments of the population in many countries around the world, if not all, with respect to vaccine hesitancy in particular. And clearly, it's a basic principle of social marketing that we need to understand who we're trying to interact with, who we're talking to, but we need to listen to our audience and understand them before we can effectively talk to them. So next slide, please. So these are just some fairly standard segmentation variables, but it's good to remember this, especially with respect to COVID-19, and to really focus our attention on, okay, which of these segmentation variables are most critical? But we can think about demographic characteristics like age, gender, stage of life, sexuality, education, religion, and so forth. We can also think about location-specific factors, urban versus rural, the climate that the person is living in, country around the world. We can think about different situations that people are in, so social situations, benefits that might be offered, usage rates, how frequently someone has engaged in vaccinations in the past. And then we can think about things like psychographic characteristics, so motivations, aspirations, values, beliefs, attitudes. These are all critical factors, as we'll see. We'll get into some more specific examples in a second. Next slide, please. So really you can break this down into basically four fairly straightforward questions. Who are we interacting with, right? How old is the person? What is their level of education? What generation did they come from? Things like that. Where are they, right? What part of the world are they in? What kind of home do they live in? Things of that nature. What are we talking about, right? Their status, their usage rate in terms of vaccination, their attitudes towards the product that's being offered, the specific vaccine. And there is more than one COVID vaccine. We should remember that. And the why. What actually is motivating them to want to engage in this? Is it because they want to protect their family? Is it because they want to protect their community? What's motivating them? What are their values? Next slide. And so we could think about this in terms of some fairly obvious kind of profiles of segmentation, right? So we can take these variables and we can construct different scenarios or situations, combinations of factors that might define an audience that we really need to think about. So you could think about sort of four profiles here. This is from an article, a systematic review that was on under vaccination rates in Europe. Four categories: the hesitant, those who perhaps have some kind of safety concern or issue, or they're unsure about the need, right? So they're hesitant but not completely resistant. The unconcerned, maybe they just simply have low risk perceptions. They don't really see any real risk of vaccine preventable diseases, so they're not concerned about being vaccinated. The poorly reached, those perhaps who are suffering from some aspect of the digital divide. They lack information. Maybe they don't have access to services. These are significant barriers that we face in many parts of the world, if not all. And then the active resistors, people who are quite well informed, but they simply, for various reasons, personal, cultural, etc., are opposed to becoming vaccinated. So you can think about these different profiles. Next slide, please. And, this is just another way of kind of visualizing this idea, right? You could think about a 2x2 matrix of compliance and exposure to information, exposure to promotional efforts, social marketing efforts to promote the vaccines. And you could think about people in low risk categories, very low risk, high risk, and moderate risk based on these different factors, right? And you could think about that also in terms of the dimension of age, which is clearly a risk factor, especially for COVID-19, younger versus older. So we could try to sort of plot people's status on a 2x2 matrix like this. So we'll get into this in a little bit more detail, and I'm going to turn it back over to Jeff.
Okay, thanks, Doug. Next slide. So yeah, if we have the next slide up, great. Competition and barrier analysis is the next kind of characteristic we want to look at. Next slide. So, of course, there are various forms of competition out there. Active competition from anti-vax movements. That's probably representing a minority of people in most countries, or many countries. There's passive competition in the form of inaccurate media coverage, media overemphasizing things like non-compliance. And there's competition from structural and economic factors, of course, as well. Some people find their economic, social, transport situation gets in the way of them having easy access to vaccines. Next slide. Of course, competition can also be internal. Many people are overconfident that they won't become infected. They're young, fit, and so on. People put a lot more sway by their immediate situation rather than valuing long-term maybe protection in terms of the vaccine acceptance. And also people are very loss averse. We know this. Even if there's a very small chance of some negative consequence of vaccination, many people will take that in consideration and maybe overplay that threat. Next slide. The fourth thing that we think everybody needs to do to create effective, efficient, and ethical programs is to mobilize all the assets that we've got, all the stakeholders, all the partners. No one organization, no one public health body of its own, using its own resources, is going to solve this problem in terms of getting the majority of the people to be vaccinated and accept that positively, or even keep people maintaining protective behaviors. So we have to create a more community approach to delivering interventions, and countries that have done very well seem to have done that more, rather than adopting a top-down approach to driving change, influencing behavior from the top. Next slide. Okay, so we need to get from this position of trying to engender herd immunity to what we could call community protection. Next slide. This means using marketing and social marketing principles of co-production, viral marketing, engaging everybody in the community and with all our stakeholders who can play a part, using their resources, their outreach, the trust that they have, the connections that they have in communities. Next slide. This is a report that we'd recommend to you from OECD a couple of years back, which talks about harnessing the power of citizens' ideas and the people behind them, community engagement and action, particularly if we're trying to contact hard to reach members of the community. Working with and through other community members can be a very powerful way to do that, but it won't just happen. We have to put time and effort and money into making that work. Next slide. One of the other issues associated with mobilizing all of our assets is the commercial sector, not-for-profit sector, academic sector, trying to get all of these sectors to work together to make a contribution. And many for-profit companies are out there trying to do that at the moment. And of course, none of the vaccines that have been developed so far would have happened without the input of huge investment from the private sector. In terms of the distribution and logistics, a lot of private sector companies are going to be involved there as well. So there's a need to bind together and start to create more strategic partnerships in terms of our assets between public, private, for-profit, and NGO sectors. Okay, over to you, Doug.
Thanks very much, Jeff. So let's now talk about our fifth key action, which is vaccine demand building. This is really a critical factor and where we get into some of the specifics. So we could think about different phases of COVID, 4 phases in particular of COVID-19 vaccine promotion. And if you can just advance this slide so that we get all the factors up there. So the first one is obviously COVID-19 protective behaviors compliance, right? Hand washing, social distancing, and all of the factors that have been promoted in terms of keeping ourselves safe during the lockdown periods. Positive vaccine concept promotion, so having a positive attitude or belief about vaccines and about vaccination in particular. Then focusing in on COVID-specific vaccination trust and access promotion. Do I actually trust that the COVID vaccines are going to be effective? And we've seen a number of things done already to try to promote that, such as celebrities, people like Dr. Anthony Fauci in the United States, for example, getting the vaccine on television, online, and then ongoing vaccination compliance, being persistent and consistent in actually promoting compliance. And so there are a number of things we need to do to try to drive each of these demand factors and move people through the phases of COVID-19 vaccination promotion. Next slide, please. So it's really not enough to knock down a myth, really, and then leave some kind of a narrative vacuum, right? Vaccines can cause injury and death. Say no to Bill Gates. Well, all right, fine. You're opposed, but then, you know, what are we going to do about that? If you could just cue up the rest of the slide. We really need to create a credible and attractive alternative narrative, right? When we're trying to build demand, obviously we do need to eliminate myths and get people to not believe these things like vaccines can cause injury and death, but that's not enough. We actually have to create a positive brand, if you will, around vaccination. And that's really one of the approaches that I think that has been successful in vaccine promotion more generally and that we can learn from in the context of COVID-19. Next slide, please. So, you know, what is involved in developing that positive narrative, what I described as a brand identity around COVID-19 vaccination? These are 6 factors that we can think about that are derived from the literature. So developing tailored messages on known motivators for specific groups. Again, using our understanding, having listened to our audiences and understanding and then validating their concerns and addressing potential fears so that the alternative that we're trying to promote, the positive vaccination behavior, is actually desirable, right? We're trying to promote that as a desirable alternative. Emphasizing positive gains and possible losses, explaining how to access vaccines so that it's something that people can do, they have self-efficacy, using trusted sources and advocates, I mentioned Fauci, for example, and honest and transparent communications. Next slide, please. So I'll just briefly mention an example that I've worked on in the past in the context of HPV vaccination promotion. And this was a project that I worked on with the Girl Effect organization a few years ago. They run a branded lifestyle-focused program in Rwanda called Ninyaminga, or NN. And basically, it's a lifestyle around growing up and being successful as a young woman. And Ninyaminga is a program that promotes specific issues. It cross-cuts a wide variety of issues and promotes positive knowledge, attitudes, behaviors, and norms around a number of different sectors: health, education, economic empowerment, and safety. And it works with a lot of different social sectors, supply-side services, NGOs, and so forth, to provide a wide variety of relevant information to girls. So it's essentially a horizontal platform. Next slide, please. And it uses a wide range of voices and formats. So older role models, essentially an Ask Auntie kind of character, Baza Shangazi, as she's called. And so she's a trusted source of information for Rwandan girls, becomes very recognizable. And youth role models. So a youth empowerment model where slightly older girls, 18 plus, are essentially acting as journalists and creating an identity for this program. And then a radio drama, a fictional drama featuring adolescent girls and boys and characters that are living through complex life experiences. Essentially, what was done was promoting HPV vaccination through this platform, using it as a basis for demand creation because of all the assets, the branded assets that the program already had, and building on that. I'm going to turn it back over to you, Jeff.
Thanks, Doug. Okay, next slide. So community engagement is the sixth pillar of what we think is effective practice. Next slide. A good example of engaging communities and the power that they bring, I think, has been delivered in New Zealand, where there's been a big focus on the kind of New Zealand team of 5 million, the population, to tackle COVID, and a focus on creating a narrative around it. It's about beating the virus. It's not about blaming people or blaming the government. Next slide. I think we know a lot about community engagement. It's a big discipline. We know how to do that, and we know the benefits of getting people to work together to solve problems and create solutions. This is a great reference to a book on this slide called Humankind that I'd really recommend to you, which sets out to debunk lots of the myths about how humans, when you put them under stress, become horrible. When you put people under stress, most of us, we become better and want to look after each other and help others. So I think, there's a lot of positive evidence out there about the power of bringing people together and the positive impact it can have. Next slide. So we need to get away from just thinking about sending messages to audiences. It's about engaging with them to create the stories, create the narratives, and create the community action to solve problems. This is just an example from Vietnam, a low to middle income country that's done a remarkably good job by leveraging in lots of community assets and community action to prevent and find cases of COVID-19. Next slide. So it's about working with citizens and making sure that they're engaged in the development, delivery, and evaluation of vaccine promotion and uptake programs. In the UK, as an example, we've had the government asked people to come forward and volunteer to help with vaccine promotion rollout, and hundreds of thousands of people have come forward and volunteered to help with that. Next slide. We can also see in a number of countries that have done particularly well so far in the kind of find and treat stages of the pandemic, they've adopted a full co-production approach to understanding the disease, tracking infected people, and promoting protective behaviors. This is the kind of thing we're going to need more of when we get into the next phase, which is vaccine promotion and uptake. Next slide. We also need to think about what's going to actually motivate people to come along. And many of you, I'm sure, will know about Hertzberg's work around motivational factors and hygiene factors. Well, the hygiene factors are that the vaccine needs to be believed to be safe, effective, and accessible. Okay, but that is not going to get people through the door necessarily. Without those, people are not going to come along, but they're not sufficient on their own. What we also need to think about is what will actually motivate people. What do they want from vaccination? And what people want, sure, they want protection for them and their families, but they also want their freedom back. Their freedom to travel, to socialize with other people, to meet. They want some fun back in their life. So these are the things we also need to emphasize when we're promoting the vaccine. Next slide. Making it easy for people is our seventh pillar of kind of good practice. Next slide. So if we're going to make it hard or difficult or complex for people to access a vaccine, then we're going to get huge dropout numbers. So use approaches like participatory design to work with citizens to create solutions to any barriers that they might perceive in terms of getting access. Obviously, make the vaccine free, ideally, if not very low cost, make it available everywhere, and at things like times that people can easily get to that fit around their other life commitments. Okay, over to you, Slide. Over to you, Slide. Over to you, Doug.
Good. All right. Thank you, Jeff. Yeah. So we're in the home stretch here. Let's talk about marketing promotion strategy, our 8th pillar. Next slide, please. So I think those of us who work in social marketing know this, and for those of us who are kind of coming into the field, this is a critical developmental factor in the field over the last number of years. Really, we've moved from thinking of marketing as a kind of tactical function to thinking about it strategically. And we talked about the systemic and systematic process that's used in social marketing earlier, but really we need to think strategically about how we're using our marketing, our social marketing approaches to promote COVID-19. Next slide, please. And so, part of this is brings us back to something that Jeff talked about earlier, this whole idea of co-creation and participatory social transformation. This is an article from a few years ago about redefining social marketing. It's more than just behavioral change. It's especially not just individual behavior change, but rather it's thinking about social transformation, about changing the social dialogue, the way society is structured, creating environments, if you will, in which things like COVID-19 vaccination are easier and more likely to actually happen. Next slide, please. So let's think about how that has been done, and I think we can definitely build beyond this. But our 9th pillar is really thinking about proactive news and media relations and outreach in order to create a positive social dialogue around vaccination in particular. Next slide, please. So obviously the media contributes significantly, for better or worse, to confidence, hesitancy, fears, and risk-benefit perceptions. So historically, we've had the agenda-setting research field and media advocacy as a social marketing strategy, essentially working upstream to try to influence the way an issue like COVID-19 vaccination is processed in the media environment, and using the media as a tool to develop a proactive strategy for reaching the public, to work with the media in order to have specific strategies to influence public debate and understanding of the benefits of COVID-19 vaccination. Next slide, please. And this involves a lot of things: being proactive, rolling briefings, story generation, editorial feeds, facilitating access to health experts, advisors, and data. And it's not just the traditional news media, it's clearly also social media and the tremendous power and influence that a number of individuals have gained through their followings on Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, and other major platforms. It's not just the traditional media, it's these influencers who, if we can marshal them, become tremendously powerful advocates for vaccination. So really also thinking in terms of understanding what does that media environment look like, 24/7 media monitoring, tracking of both traditional and social media, and also rebutting false claims that are out there and using our celebrities, our people like Dr. Fauci in the United States, and basically creating a sustainable system for correcting myths and misinformation. Next slide, please. And back over to you, Jeff.
Thanks, Doug. Okay, so this is the last pillar. As Doug was just saying, digital and media strategy. Next slide. So, the power of social media is vast. Some might say too vast. But there are a number of things we think need to be done to harness social media to best possible effect. So a dialogue and joint strategy with social media providers and platforms. Secondly, and very topical given what's happened in the last couple of days, it's about working proactively with social media platforms and in a voluntary way if possible, but if not, moving to regulate those platforms if they continue to put out false or misinformation. There's active work that's to be done about feeding social media with rolling, stories and trust building, and also providing support for likes to other supportive voices that are out there in the community. Okay, next slide. So we're going to try and go sum this up for you in the last couple of minutes. Next slide. Let's go back to our list of 10. This is what we're going to walk you through at the top of the presentation. Next slide. If we were forced to pick 3 of those things, we know it's a big ask to do all of them. These are the 3 that we would pick. First of all, systematic behavior change planning. Be really clear about what it is you're trying to do in terms of vaccine uptake. Second thing would be really clear about which target groups you're going for, and that would be facilitated by having a good segmentation model. And 3, think about and put effort into co-production, working with others, leveraging in all the assets that are out there in the community. Next slide. We don't think it's about using slick behavioral science techniques and approaches to manipulate people into what we want them to do, because if we try and do that, that's going to be spotted and there will be huge resistance to it. It is about understanding and working with people in a collaborative way to create solutions that people support and value. Next slide. So in diagrammatic form, this is what we're talking about. It's about creating social value and social protection in terms of vaccine delivery, but it's also about creating personal value. And as we've seen earlier on in the presentation, it's not just about protection from disease. It's about other things that people might value, like their freedom and their ability to connect with other members of the community. Next slide. So what this means is we have to put a lot more effort into understanding the people that we're seeking to influence, and not just members of the public, but also professionals. And we know that there are resistors and people that spread misinformation within the public health services. Next slide. There's also a need, we think, to invest more. If the pandemic has shown one thing, it's demonstrated that many countries, many public health departments and others don't have sufficient people with marketing and communication experience positioned in such a place in the hierarchy that they can actually direct programs and make them maximally effective. So we're hoping that one of the silver linings that will come out of this terrible pandemic is that people, once they do their reviews, will notice that they need more expertise in this area, and they need to position it at a high level strategic position within organizations where this best practice can be put into action. Over to you, Doug.
Great. So let me just bring us to conclusion here by noting 4 takeaway points that I think we all hopefully will remember from this presentation. A big budget is not necessary, but obviously it helps. There certainly have been unsuccessful campaigns that had big budgets, so it's not the only factor, but it certainly helps. We need to work with our communities and all sectors. I think in some of the examples that Jeff and I talked about, we saw that there was multi-sector involvement in successful vaccination promotion efforts. Obviously, time is of the essence. We really need to get on this vaccination promotion effort for COVID-19 right now. We need to be planning and acting now. And we have a professional and a moral duty to apply what we know works in this field, which is really what the presentation today is all about. Next slide, please. And we also need to be confident, frankly. We can do this. We don't need to worry and wring our hands. We need to get out there and act. And so this is really a critical time point for us to take action. Next slide, please. We summarized this in our paper, and I think that just to reiterate, this is really intended to be an evidence-based summary of recommendations. We're drawing on the best evidence that we have from the social marketing field in general, and specifically efforts that have been focused on other forms of vaccine promotion and what we know from those efforts. Next slide. So here's our contact information, and we are happy to take your questions. I think we're just about on our time here.
Yep, your timing was perfect. Thank you very much, Jeff and Doug. That was a lot of rich data, rich content that you took us through on the key guidelines for vaccine uptake, and certainly explaining how social marketing can contribute to vaccine uptake in ways it might not be contributing as much as it could right now. We do have a lot of questions, and Christine tells me we can actually take a few extra minutes for those questions. So hopefully we can get through a whole batch of them. I doubt we'll get through all of them, but we'll do our best to get through as many as possible. And I'm just going to read them according to the ones that have had the most votes. So I'll do it in that order. And the one that has the most votes right now is, what do you think is the biggest barrier to public health agencies adopting the kind of systemic citizen-centered approach that you are advocating? And we know in social marketing, barrier analysis is really important. It's a place to start. So what are those barriers?
I'll just say one quick thing and then let Jeff maybe comment in more detail. But being in the United States, one of the barriers that we run into is public agencies' inability to really use creative, out-of-the-box kinds of approaches. And they're somewhat constrained by regulatory structures and bureaucracy. And while they have a lot of resources and capabilities, they're often not really able to be nimble and creative. So I'll say that that's a big barrier. Jeff, you probably have more.
Yeah. For me, what I see is that, and it goes back to something I said in the presentation, that it's where you position your comms and marketing and behavioral change expertise in the chain of command. If you work in a private sector organization, a board level director will be in charge of marketing and comms. If you go to most public health institutes, marketing and comms people are third or fourth level in line functionaries who are brought into the room once the big people have made decisions about what should happen. And a lot of those kind of senior policy people and politicians start inventing communication strategies that they think are going to work. Now, this is just amateurish in the extreme. So this is something, and hopefully everybody on the call, we all have a role to kind of challenge that. This is because it's not just a nice to have. This is a matter of life and death. We wouldn't get somebody who's got a broken leg and just say, oh, to any nurse or any doctor, have a go at fixing that. You're a non-specialist. We've got a huge amount of data about what works and what doesn't work. And it seems to me, the moral and professional imperative is to apply that. So we need to do some challenging, and there'll be huge opportunities to do that as each country, in the next year or so, starts to review what went well and what did not go well, and what do we need to put in place, to up the performance next time around. So there's an opportunity for us here, I think.
Okay, thank you. Those are big barriers, and sounds like there's a need for social marketers to speak up, let their voices be heard, and try to get, it's a matter of upstream marketing to the policymakers, sounds like. Okay. Our next question is, what are you seeing now in terms of vaccine promotion that you believe is effective, and why do you think it's effective?
I'll start. I think we need to think about this in a few phases, as Doug was saying. At the moment, in most countries, because vaccines are only just being approved and starting to be rolled out, there's more demand than there is supply. So in a sense, we don't have a problem in using up all the vaccine we're going to have for the next couple of months, because there's more people out there. So in a sense, you just need to make people aware that this is available. Please come. The bigger challenge is going to be when we get to that position where we have a big supply of vaccine, but we're starting to hit those people that are more resistant. So we haven't seen, I don't think, many interventions yet aimed at those resistors. I'm sure I hope governments are developing those, but the focus at the moment is all on the early group, where there's not much resistance. So I think we have to watch this space. I can't personally pick out any examples at the moment about dealing with the resistor end of things. On the please come and get it end of the spectrum, that's about clarity of contact with target groups, often through people like carer groups, or if people are or one of the first cohorts in most countries are people over the age of 80. Lots of those people are in contact with caring organizations, or they live in caring organizations. Working with those organizations is an effective way to get those older people vaccinated.
And Doug?
Yeah, I would just add that I think we need to look to other vaccination promotion campaigns on other topics that have been done. I mean, really, that's our best guidance. Other social marketing efforts on other vaccines, such as I gave the HPV example. And I think really the two key factors there that I would point to are trust issues, creating trusted sources that are highly desirable and, you might say, aspirational for the audience, and understanding who is going to be trusted and persuasive for a specific audience. In the HPV case, it was adolescent girls, and so an older role model who's kind of an authority figure, or then someone who's slightly older than you, who you might look up to and want to be like, right? Using those kinds of role modeling techniques. And then the other thing is not thinking of vaccination as sort of in isolation. It's something that we do as part of our larger health and lifestyle, right? It's not just something it's not a one-off thing that, well, that's the end of it. It's embedded in a social context, and trying to understand what that social context is and making it desirable for other reasons than simply getting the shot, right? I think those are some key things that we know and have seen work in other vaccination promotion efforts.
I mean, it's also, there's quite a lot of power in using testimonials for relatable people as well. There's been quite a lot of work on either using people like me to attract me to go and get a vaccine, right, and other credible people like doctors, community leaders, that kind of thing.
Okay, thank you both. And I'm sorry, I forgot to attribute that question. That question came from Darcy Sawatsky. I hope I'm pronouncing that all right. Our next question comes from Kennedy. I'm not sure how to pronounce this, Swallow. The question is, how do you perform message testing with such a fast-paced topic as vaccination? Without the luxury of time, it is a struggle to ensure our messages will resonate. And certainly I can add that in the COVID environment, things do move quickly and change quickly. There's always seems to be new measures. There's always seems to be new information about the actual virus to absorb and respond to. So it is a very fast-paced environment that we're living in right now. So how do you perform message testing in such a fast-paced environment and with such a fast-paced topic as vaccination without that luxury of time?
I'll just mention one thing, and then Jeff maybe wants to say more in detail, but the use of digital research platforms, which has just expanded exponentially in recent years, and our ability to reach populations quite rapidly through, for example, existing internet-based panels of participants who have already pre-agreed to participate in research studies, and then using tools like where we can simulate the way an individual would consume information, for example, on YouTube or on a social media platform. You can actually create simulated environments where somebody consumes an advertisement, for example, and you can, in real time, conduct rapid testing of their reactions to that advertising. I'm using some of these techniques in my work right now, so it's top of mind. But I'll just mention those as sort of rapid response methods.
Yeah. I mean, I think social media does give us those kinds of opportunities, and it's very. I mean, there's no easy answer to this, right? It's very difficult with the science changing on an almost weekly basis around some of the aspects of COVID and its prevention. But I think with specifically thinking about vaccine promotion, which is what this seminar is kind of focused on, I think we do have to put the effort in, albeit in a kind of moving environment, to do that message testing, because the kind of temptation or the danger is, because things are moving and we have some uncertainties, we won't bother to do it, and somehow things will be okay. Well, that's a bear trap to be avoided at all costs. I think we have to, as professionals in this area, do we want to fly blind and just guess stuff? We might get lucky. It might be, effective. Some creative agency might come up with some great slogan that kind of works, that they've dreamt up overnight, but that's a risky strategy. So I would say that, as difficult as it is, we do have to invest in, thoroughly, developing pilot testing and winnowing out the weak messaging strategies. But we know a lot, actually, about, from past experience, about how to frame messages. And there's lots of guidance out there already that we can use. So, there are some templates we can use and checklists to assess, potential messaging strategies. And some of the kind of ones that are, obviously going to go wrong should be able to be spotted fairly easily, I would have thought.
Okay. To get a little more specific, are there specific social marketing tactics you would recommend to increase vaccine uptake, and why? I know you've shared some with us in the presentation, but if you can drill down a little bit more into something specific.
Sure. I think, I'll just mention something and then Jeff can elaborate. But, the whole approach of educational entertainment or edutainment, I think has tremendous potential, especially because you can overcome anti-vaccine norms that way. You can create narratives. We talked about this whole sort of overarching strategy of creating an alternative narrative, of kind of rebranding vaccination as something that's desirable for those who might be hesitant or resistant. And one of the most powerful ways to do that is to create engaging stories that draw people in. And so using entertainment techniques is obviously a proven strategy for doing that. And we've got a lot of evidence now from the educational entertainment literature across numerous cultures where we've successfully applied those kinds of techniques, and evidence that they can in fact be very powerful demand creation, demand generation strategies. So I'll just mention that example.
Yeah, I mean, we've already mentioned things like testimonials from, relatable people. I think they can be, or have been shown to be, very helpful. Using incentives and disincentives. So we're thinking about both, tangible and intangible incentives and disincentives. Some countries, for example, in terms of disincentives, won't, in other vaccine programs, won't allow children to go to school until they've got a full set of shots, for example. So, think about, are there, things where we can put in place disincentives that will encourage people? It might be in the travel industry. You want to go on holiday? Well, okay, if you want to go on holiday and fly on this plane, you're going to have to give us proof that you've been vaccinated. There, in terms of positive incentives, there are all kinds of things that you could offer to people in terms of cash or cash equivalent incentives, access to things like, you might say, well, okay, if you want to come into a bar, you need to have a proof of vaccination. Storytelling is also another well-proven approach, within community development programs, developing community relatable stories and having them told by relatable people through things like, public health related soap operas, for instance. Using emotional calls that play to people's value systems, rather than just factual information about access issues to vaccines. So positioning vaccines as highly desirable because of this, that, you know, that what they say about you in a social context, i.e. you're a caring parent, mother, brother, child. So that, you know,
Right.
there's a whole range of actual techniques you can use.
Right. Thank you so much. We do have to wrap up. We did get a little extra time for questions, but we have run out of time. I feel really lucky we had two speakers to answer questions and that we got through as many questions as we did. Hope they brought a lot of value to the listeners. I certainly feel that there's been a lot of value in this presentation today, both strategically and with some very specific, specific practical tips. You have Doug's and Jeff's contact information. I'm sure they'd be available for answering any further questions that we didn't get to today. So you still have access to them, and you have access to the webinar recording and PDF slides once they appear on the ISMA website, if you are a member. And I'll leave it there for today and hand it back to Christine.
Thanks so much. Thank you, Tamara. Thank you, Jeff and Doug, and thanks to all of our participants in today's webinar. ISMA members, please take a few moments to cast your vote for ISMA's board of directors while I still have your attention. We have 10 eligible candidates from across the globe who want to serve this association and its members. It only takes a few moments of your time to do that, and we really want feedback from the members of the association. So please try to do that today. Voting is open until January 21st. And before we wrap up this webinar here very shortly, we would love to hear your feedback about today's webinar. The poll will be popping up. There it is. There's a couple of questions relating to the quality of today's webinar. We really depend on your answers for the development of our future webinars. So please take a moment to share your feedback. Finally, as the news turns from COVID case counts to images of people getting vaccinated, hope is beginning to break through. Jeff, Doug, thank you for giving us hope. I wholeheartedly agree with Jeff's recommendation to read the book Humankind by Rutger Bregman. That was a highlight for me in 2020 in reading that and giving me hope about humankind and what we can accomplish together, as well as through our social marketing practice and all of the wonderful strategies and tactics that you have encouraged and recommended today. Thanks to our members and participants in today's webinar, and thank you all for your continued support and participation in our association. We hope to see you at our next webinar. Thank you to Dave, Tamara, as well as the wider team. This is all a group of volunteers who are working to bring you this amazing content. Everybody puts in a lot of time behind the scenes into organizing these events, so thank you to everyone and all of our volunteers across the association. This is the International Social Marketing Association, and we now conclude today's webinar. Thank you.